Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this breakout panel entitled Data. You can't hear me? Is this better? Okay. Thank you guys for joining this panel this afternoon entitled Data, Algorithmic Integrity, and Artificial Intelligence. My name is Austin Rogers. I am the Chief Civil Counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And among the issues in my portfolio is the issue of AI. And I would say that when I first came to the Hill, AI was certainly talked about in passing. Everyone was, it was on everyone's mind. They were debating it, discussing it. But I noticed an inflection point within the past year, really, where I would estimate that it probably comes up in nearly a fourth of my meetings, and we are now working on several bills pertaining to AI, including one that passed the Senate this past Congress. So clearly it's all the rave on the Hill right now. It's all the rave in Washington, D.C. There's an executive order about it, and a lot of people have their attention fixated on it. But as I've worked on this issue, there's been sort of two things that have stood out to me. The first is that this is a rapidly evolving tool and landscape. And with that in mind, it's really difficult to come up with rigid sort of Procrustean standards and guidelines that are going to regulate this tool. And the second thing that sort of stood out to me is I think people speculate a lot, myself included, but I don't think anyone really knows the impact that it's going to have on the fabric of our culture, our society, on the legal profession, relevant here, and the law in general. With that in mind, it's a very pressing and important topic today. Really excited about our panel. I had originally prepared remarks and was going to introduce each panelist. And in preparing those remarks, I punched into ChatGPT, write me a brief introductory paragraph for our panel. And among the words used were controversial, unconventional, and I decided probably the safer play would be to just read from my notes. I have since come to find out that Judge Vaden will be introducing our panelists, so that's my bad. But I'll give Judge Vaden a very brief introduction. The Honorable Stephen Alexander Vaden. Judge Vaden has served on the United States Court of International Trade since 2020. Before joining the court, Judge Vaden served as General Counsel of the USDA, where he supervised hundreds of attorneys, thousands of cases, hundreds of thousands of employees, and hundreds of billions of dollars. Wow. Judge Vaden also served as a member of the board of the Commodity Credit Corporation from 2017 to 2020. In the private sector, Judge Vaden worked for Jones Day and Patton Boggs. At both firms, Judge Vaden served as an appellate litigator and as part of the firm's political law practices. Judge Vaden graduated from Yale Law School and from Vanderbilt University. As an Alabama fan, whose team infamously lost to Judge Vaden this past season, I will try not to hold it against him, and I'll yield the floor to him.
Well, to make you feel a little better, we also, it's on. To make you feel a little better, we also beat Auburn too. So we went 2-0 against the state of Alabama this year. So, we are here to talk about artificial intelligence. Not to be confused with what emanates from the bureaucracy here in Washington, D.C. That is known as natural stupidity. Our panel will examine the current artificial intelligence regulatory debate and landscape, and how governmental regulation, both here and abroad, may shape the technological options available in the future to us all. From issues of national security and concerns about a 21st century version of HAL from A Space Odyssey, our panel will ask two questions. Are regulators wise enough to understand the technology that they seek to regulate? And regardless of the answer to the first question, what should they do about it? Fortunately, we have some wise guides who will lead us through their thoughts, and I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. Each will have approximately 8 minutes to talk about what they see for the future. Then we'll have time for me to ask some questions along with some cross-chat and them to respond to others' thoughts. And I hope you will be coming up with questions as well, because in our final section, we're going to turn it over to you for you to ask questions. One brief announcement: the Federalist Society would like for me to remind you that today, this is our last panel, and so if you are seeking CLE credit at the conclusion of today's panel, please remember to sign out by scanning the QR code found on the back of your brochure or elsewhere on posters throughout the building. So with no further ado, I will introduce our panelists. First up, we have Ms. Victoria Jeffries. Ms. Jeffries works for Meta, where she is on their public policy team and is particularly focused on issues of competition policy and artificial intelligence. Ms. Jeffries began her career at the Federal Trade Commission and received her law degree from Emory University School of Law. Next up will be Mr. Stewart Baker. Mr. Baker currently practices law at Steptoe & Johnson. Before joining that firm, he had a list of impressive governmental positions, including serving as the first confirmed assistant, now Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, General Counsel for the National Security Agency, as well as the General Counsel for the commission that looked into the intelligence failures that led to the Iraq War. He served as a law clerk to the late Justice John Paul Stevens. Third will be Mr. Christopher Ekren. Mr. Ekren is Global Technology Counsel for Sony Corporation of America. Before joining Sony, he practiced with a major Silicon Valley law firm, and he is a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. And last but never least, we have Professor John Yoo, who is the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. He is also a fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, and for this academic year, he is a visiting professor at the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. You all know Professor Yoo is an expert on the intersection of national security and the law, and he clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. And so, with a warm welcome to all of our panelists, I turn it over to you, Ms. Jeffries.
Thank you, Judge Vaden, and thank you to the Federalist Society for putting on this timely panel. So I have been tasked with setting the table here a little bit from a technology point of view, which I recognize is sort of a dangerous place to be when this is the last thing standing between all of you and cocktail hour. So hopefully we can keep it lively here. So I'll start with something that I think we're all increasingly beginning to recognize, which is that artificial intelligence has more potential than any other modern technology to increase human productivity, creativity, and quality of life. It accelerates economic growth while unlocking critical areas like medical and scientific research. But let's take a moment to talk about what exactly is AI. So there's no universally accepted definition, but generally at Meta, when we talk about AI, we mean a computer system that is capable of performing tasks that typically require human intelligence, visual perception, speech recognition, and the like. Large language models are an example of that kind of computer system. Metas are multimodal, multilingual, and come in a variety of sizes to accommodate different use cases. At a very basic level, this is really a system of statistical predictive analyses. Today in the market, we see a spectrum of models available on a closed or API basis or different degrees of open. Llama, Meta's large language model, is by many measures the leading open source AI foundation model. It is freely available for both research and commercial use. We'll come back to the role of open source in the market in a moment. But I'd like to touch on what is not happening currently. You may have heard reference to artificial general intelligence, which many say is not a thing, or human-level artificial intelligence. And you've probably heard those phrases in connection with some very dire warnings about machines taking over the world and the like. Discussions around human-level artificial intelligence are interesting, but ultimately not a productive place for policymakers and legal practitioners to spend their time right now. According to Jan LeCun, Meta's AI chief AI scientist, and other scientific leaders in the space, if we're lucky, and by that I mean making several critical breakthroughs, we're potentially talking years to decades until we get to something like human-level artificial intelligence. Think about the most powerful AI models today. They can do amazing things. But to put things in perspective, in terms of computational inputs and processing, a human 4-year-old will have ingested and processed as much data as today's most powerful models. Human-level artificial intelligence requires understanding how the world works, being able to build world models based on sensory inputs, persistent memory, an ability to reason and plan. So, in other words, today's AI models are very, very good at chess, but they could not navigate a DC cocktail party. So, having sort of level set on what we're talking about here from a technology point of view, it's important to put this in its economic context as well. According to JP Morgan research published earlier this year, AI has the potential to drive labor productivity growth and could raise global GDP by 10%, or about $10 trillion in global GDP. So looping back to the point of your 4-year-old having more knowledge than the most powerful AI, it's worth clarifying that AI is not going to replace people or workers, but people or businesses who don't learn how to use AI as a tool, like other transformative technologies such as the internet, may fall behind in the market. This is a critical point when we consider it in the context of what we see coming out of Europe. Policymakers and economists there are sounding the alarm that the existing and growing productivity gap between Europe and the US is largely explained by the tech sector. And further, that innovation, scale, and growth in this sector in Europe is being hindered by inconsistent and restrictive regulations. So when you consider the effect of AI adoption on productivity and growth, we may begin to see that that gap between the US and the EU could become a chasm. There's a reason that the US economy is the engine and the envy of the world, and it's due in large part to our light touch approach to regulation in favor of experimentation, innovation, competition, and growth. And that brings me to open source. I'll just touch on this briefly before the gong rings, and I'm sure that we'll have a great discussion about it. But making an AI model open source means that anyone can use that engine to build their own AI chatbots, apps, and much, much more. The central benefit of open source AI is that it lowers barriers to entry and innovation. Developers and firms can build and compete on top of open source models without having to worry about the upfront time and capital investments required to develop and train a model. That results in cost savings, a flourishing of AI-driven solutions in the market, faster implementation times, greater privacy and security, and more. In other words, open source AI is like rocket fuel for innovation and economic growth, which is more important than ever in a world of great power competition. National security is inextricably linked with economic output, innovation, and job growth. So widespread adoption of American open source AI models serves both economic and security interests. America must embrace open innovation or risk ceding our AI lead to foreign adversaries, including China, hurting our economy and potentially putting our national security at risk. In the global competition on AI, we know China is already investing more than $1 trillion to surpass the US technologically, and Chinese tech companies are releasing their own open AI models as fast or faster than companies in the US. That's hundreds of open models to date. Whether we want it or not, the US is in a race to form the foundation for AI development around the world. This standard, or AI substrate, will become embedded in technology, infrastructure, manufacturing, global finance, and e-commerce. So it's critical that the United States stay ahead in this race. Meta's open models, like other US open models, are based on American values and high standards of openness, transparency, and accountability. These open models will form a cornerstone of American global leadership and technology supremacy. I'm pretty proud of that and very much looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
What do I need to do here? Maybe you need to turn that off. Mine is just not working. Okay. So I agree with Victoria on a lot of stuff and disagree on some stuff, but let me give you my sense of how we got here, talking about with a kind of consensus that some sort of regulation, light touch, hard touch, baseball bat upside the head, which is the EU Act, is appropriate. It's not because AI is uniquely powerful or likely to go off in the wrong direction, except for the fact that the people who developed this were so surprised at various times at how well it performed that they began to worry that within a matter of years, this decade, the AI actually would achieve a kind of self-sufficiency and become smarter than the people who designed it. Now, and worse, that it would then go off and do things that nobody imagined because they weren't able to keep up with it. And the famous example is if you told it that its job was to make paper clips, it would get so smart and so controlling in making paper clips that it would just turn us all into paper clips. And this prospect of an uncontrollable, autonomous artificial intelligence was treated seriously by a lot of people who were in the field, who gave it 5%, 10% risk of human extinction as a result. You know, that's not high odds, but you know, it's a pretty big number on the other side. And so people who would not otherwise be enthusiastic about regulation said, well, we probably need to do something about that. The other view that came along in response to that is people who said, if you're going to regulate AI, don't worry about the machine. Let's use it to regulate people. Let's make sure that they don't use it to spread disinformation, to misgender people, to engage in the development of biological weapons. We want the AI companies to make sure that their products can't be used for these products by people we disapprove of. They actually became the dominant regulatory force in discussions of how AI safety ought to be guaranteed, even though most of the things they were worried about were not exactly things that you would say, oh yeah, I need to regulate new technology for fear of misgendering. The debate became a debate between what I call the doomers and the Karens. And it looks as though, at least in this administration, the Karens have won that fight, to the point of becoming almost bipartisan. NIST has produced a 200-point, quote-unquote, voluntary set of standards, things you ought to worry about, that you ought to regulate for when you're building artificial intelligence. And you will not be surprised to hear that, that failure to achieve proportionate outcomes for minority groups is high on that list. There's like, there's probably 10 or 12 of those 200 tell the developers of AI, you've got to achieve proportionate outcomes. Another couple of them say, and don't let people say things they shouldn't be saying. And this has been built into the NIST standards for what AI safety means. and it has achieved such dominance over the thinking in Washington that there's actually a bipartisan bill that people are talking about passing in the lame duck session that would say AI safety institutes are hereby created, they will do these things, and what they will do is they will take this risk framework developed by NIST, and they will test and enforce it for everybody who's using AI. Pretty hefty regulation, all under the guise of light touch. I think this is probably the wrong direction for us to have gone. I really don't want to see the extinction of the human race, and I'd be willing to have a little bit of government intervention for that. But really, you know, we've all seen, actually, one of the things that they say is, please make sure that when you are asked to produce images of members of a group, that it's balanced demographically. And we all remember, right, when Google Images was producing all the black Nazis and the Asian Nazis.
Hey, watch out now. Come on now. There are no Asian Nazis.
But they had to be. They had to meet a quota. And the idea that ought to be part of what the next administration is enforcing as standards of safety for AI, I think is crazy. But it is pretty much consensus among the scientists who develop AI that they have some obligation to do this. And what I'm saying, I guess, in closing is the fact that it's light touch does not mean it isn't going to be binding, and it certainly doesn't mean that it isn't going to be crazy. And so it's really critical that the government take a much closer look at some of these quote-unquote voluntary standards that are going to be put forward by the safety institutes in order to make sure that we haven't regulated the wrong thing entirely.
So I'm required to say that I'm here personally not for Sony, and I'll start with a personal story. Around the time Richard Gere was busy visiting the Dalai Lama, I decided that was a cool thing, and I wanted to do something like that, but I'm not Richard Gere. So I decided to see the 17th Karmapa, which was more accessible and also more interesting because the way things work is the keepers of a culture or of a society find a child probably around 4 years old, and you're saying when you kind of get to that level of intelligence, and bring that child from the environment and put him in a monastery and spend a considerable amount of time stuffing the brain with facts, a lot of it neurolinguistic training, like chanting. It's not just the cognitive levels are many that someone is thought to be influenced by the leaders of that society. And there is a form, obviously, of influence that those people try to bring to perpetuate what they feel is someone that will incorporate their culture but also transcend it. So where does that go with AI? So now we have training models for large language models, and they just shove a bunch of data, and they try to follow a deep neural network model, which is similar to some people conceptually to how a brain might work. And at the end of the day, you then have what's called tuning. And whether it takes a couple of months or so, you run these models, and if you don't like the answers they're giving you, like you have a vaccine or Viking problem where it just gives you the wrong answer all the time, or what socially is viewed as a wrong answer, you correct it. And you build a shell around it, or you somehow, tweak that software. And at the end of the day, you release it, and yeah, there are going to be problems, and then you keep tweaking it, and you go through revision levels. From a code standpoint, as Stewart said, this has had a problem. I would say the Viking problem was Google ultimately trying to have representation where maybe historically there wasn't representation. And the vaccine problem is similar in the sense that you will have a lot of people that may have very diverse views on topics, and there is sort of a mainstream knowledge, but, you know, what if you're Galileo and you actually are right or more right? But most people don't believe that. Does that mean that you're not part of what AI views as reality? So when you're in that business of programming and creating this, there's a lot of tension, and if you have people that are told that you really have to have representation as an outcome in whatever process there is, then they're going to tweak it in a way that may not actually be accurate. So open source comes into this, obviously, in the sense that at least if it's open, you know what people are doing and you can adjust. If you don't like their AI, you can do another version of it, because open source in a traditional definition means that the source can be taken and it can be modified and distributed without further restrictions. Although I will tell you that a lot of things people are calling open source now do have restrictions, and some of these so-called open source licenses say you can't use this code for evil, as if that's a defined term. So one of the interesting things that I think we're seeing is a debate what is truly open, and this relates even to, I swear I didn't pick the Dalai Lama story just because you're calling your main, you know, showcase thing Lama, but even Llama, when it's reduced, when it's sent, it's not sent with the data that trained it. It's sent maybe with the tuning, and obviously you're getting the open source code, but you're not getting the training data. And there are those who will argue in the open source community that you need all the data to be able to truly tweak it and make it better in the future. Where this goes, though, from a impact is that, from a practice standpoint, human cognition is viewed by many people, and, you know, around the time I was into this Richard Gere thing, I was also into Kahneman and Tversky and all these theories of what people view as heuristics, and how the brain is basically taking shortcuts when it processes information, because it can't process everything immediately. There'd be too much latency if your brain had to look at everything as a basic question every time, just as a computer program can't recreate an entire universe, put all the logical facts into it, and then apply logic. It would just take too long. So you really have shortcuts that are these heuristics. And so what ultimately gets built into the self-reinforcement of these AIs are these heuristics, because they keep giving the same answer, and if they get a positive response to it, they just keep giving it to you. And sometimes the difference between a correct answer and a slightly incorrect answer is so small that the sensitivity to model really cannot differentiate enough to actually make a difference in the accuracy of the answer. And, you know, hopefully that'll get better over time. So where this goes from a national security standpoint, I guess, is there is this fascination with China and this view that, well, this is an existential issue, because if you're 2 weeks ahead of someone in getting to singularity and have the better AI, then their AI will beat your AI and it's over. We're not so worried about that 5% of humanity extinction, but we're quite worried about some of the differential short-term disadvantages that may occur shorter, which could be, depending on who you are, you know, pretty significant. And first, I would say a shout out to a scholar named Jeff Ding, who's actually in Washington, who does a lot of research on China AI. I would say that those of you that are interested in the issue, if that's not a resource you've considered, please take a look at what he's doing, because a lot of it is in translation and reporting, and you know, in the native language, obviously I'm not proficient, but I would say there's a lot to learn. But one of the things to realize about Tibetan or Himalayan Buddhism and AI is that there are actually many Karmapas, and as you know, the Chinese have their Dalai Lama successor, and you might argue the Dalai Lama has his successor. And that's kind of like what's going to be happening in these so-called open systems, because at the end of the day, regardless of how esoteric it is, when people claim to be open, they're only open to a certain level, and there's a certain level of control that they want to keep to maintain national advantage or some type of corporate advantage. From a corporate legal practitioner standpoint, and that's somewhat what I represent on this panel, the view is you obviously want to leverage what other people's resources, and to do that, you know, it's valuable to have things open. What seems to be the competitive advantage ultimately, though, is taking open systems and then developing a differentiation on your open system and almost adapting to what other systems do so that your AI can predictively respond to the existing and maybe majority AI to differentiate and create a competitive advantage. And so in that sense, one might say that managed openness is what corporations do, a strategy. Certainly Meta's doing that because they're not doing an open technology because it's great for the world. They're doing an open technology because they think it's going to give them an advantage when perhaps others have an existing greater advantage through a closed system, but also because there's an iterative process where you can then leverage the recontributions to the greater good. But I would say that in the area of code, it also should perhaps go to data. And there are a number of companies that are trying to work in these multipolar, multinational organizations, such as Linux Foundation, to create open data, some of which is human-centric, and some of which is unfortunately not that available. Because what we've done in America is make a lot of regulation about human data so that you really can't legally use a lot of human data because the consent has not been obtained, or it's been obtained in a way that people feel it's ethically questionable. And therefore, many companies have taken a view that they're not going to be using human training data, or they're going to be doing it under severe constraints. And when you take the view that the best data requires the best results in the best AI, you're kind of like tying your hand behind you when you do that. And so when you have, for example, Illinois biometric statutes, and you're a lawyer and you're trying to parse that and tell your client, no, I don't think you should basically be training your AI on stuff that basically is unclear about where it was obtained. Someone in the world is probably going to be doing training on that kind of data, maybe in a large country with billions of people that have a very large data set, and you're going to have a fairly constrained data set, and you know, unless you have some way to adapt around that, you're basically not going to have the best outcome. You know, there are ways to invest a lot of money and get around that. There's something called synthetic data, and that's an area that many companies are investing a lot in, but it's not the fastest and quickest way to get where you need to be. So from a philosophical standpoint, you know, getting back to what the point of AI is and how we ultimately adapt at least a corporate situation to it, I was saying that you want to have these predictive models. You want to not spend an awful lot of money recreating what other people are doing, but you want to differentiate. And I think, you know, the open source way is a way that, you know, a lot of people are beginning to adopt it, and certainly, you know, in my own practice is a certain part of it. With the story of some journey to look at philosophically how, for example, you have someone like the Karmapa or even the Dalai Lama kind of looking at human knowledge, the view is maybe preventing suffering, or maybe having people come to grips with suffering. And if you want to view it from an AI standpoint, then that's all they're trying to do is find tools to allow people to adapt to a world. And I think the question is, from a personal standpoint, but also even a technology standpoint, what is the ultimate goal if you let the AI itself determine what outcomes are intended from its use? And in that case, I don't think it's really so clear when you look at a commercial advantage that a company's trying to have, and when you look at a societal advantage. I think that the people who seek to regulate AI for these social purposes are saying that the basic rule of what they want technology to do is make the world fair. And the world isn't fair, and they really want to get to a fair world. And this is an opportunity now for those people. This is an opportunity for the people that say that technology can be used uniquely in a way to import their values and reinforce their values through the tools that people are ultimately adopting. And the challenge, I think, for all of you who are the influential people in Washington and in society is to determine how much of that you're going to let happen in an opaque way that is, frankly, either going to have a commercial direction or it's going to have this social agenda, and how much are you going to allow sunlight to reach it, and then hopefully with the knowledge of what's actually happening, people then can react to it through the political process and regulatory process, and at least understand the choices they're making when they're using this technology.
Thank you. Before starting on the substance, I just want to make a few introductory points. First, I'd like to thank the Federalist Society for inviting me to speak, but not inviting my co-author, Jeremy Rabkin, who together we wrote this book called Striking Power that actually talks about the use of AI and drones and national security. And Jeremy, it was a wonderful experience writing with him. I hope he's not here, so he can't hear me insulting him. But he's a Straussian. I loved writing with a Straussian. And I learned the only thing worse than disagreeing with a Straussian is agreeing with a Straussian. So we had a wonderful writing experience going through this, and I hope that I do justice to our co-authored work on this. Second point I want to make is in my practice life, the first time I think I really experienced or came into contact with AI is when I was in the Justice Department after 9/11, and I worked on a program to try to intercept terrorist communications coming into the United States, and that was the time of practice I had the chance to work with Ted Olson most closely, and I just wanted to recognize his passing and give you an example of what everyone's been talking about, I think, here, about what a great lawyer he was. You may remember Ted's wife, Barbara, had died in the 9/11 attacks. She was on one of the airplanes. And Ted, who was Solicitor General at the time, wanted to do what he could in the fight against Al-Qaeda. And when this program was challenged, he stepped forward to defend it in court, not at the Supreme Court, but in the lower courts. In fact, the program was challenged in the FISA Appeals Court, which had never met before. And Ted decided as Solicitor General he would argue that case. And I went to brief him on it and discuss, and he figured out an argument that had never occurred to all of us who'd worked on that program at the Justice Department that actually won the argument. It would not have succeeded if Ted had not been there. And so that to me is always stuck in my mind and my memory as an example of Ted just as a matter of character and legal ability. And so I just wanted to say that. Third thing is, I'm getting to the substance now, is I've also been puzzling about the nomination of Matt Gaetz to be Attorney General. And so I figure this must be an example of AI at work, because after a few weeks of him as Attorney General, we will accept AI as the next Attorney General. Because I can't figure it out, but I'm ready to accept the killer robots in charge of the Justice Department. So let me, I'm actually going to focus my remarks in terms of what we're seeing in the battlefields as an example of the effect of AI in national security. So we're seeing a lot, I think, in Ukraine and Israel about the just initial deployment of AI in war and what might be coming down the road. And I think it does express the kind of perspectives we heard between one view that AI and combined with robotics, which is drones, combined with space, combined with cyber, is making, if you think about it, soldiers more productive. Right? It's like warriors are more lethal. Individual warriors are now more lethal than they were before these tools. On the other hand, you have, and actually Elon Musk was one of the supporters of this campaign, the Ban Killer Robots campaign. The idea that there is some percentage risk that if AI is unleashed in the national security area, it will possibly lead to some kind of cataclysmic event. I note, by the way, these are the exact same arguments that were made with regard to nuclear weapons in the 50s and 60s. So just what we're seeing in Ukraine and Israel. First of all, AI is already at work there. Think about the Israeli Iron Dome. Think about all these high-speed, layered anti-missile, anti-aircraft defenses. They could not function without something like AI, right? Because of the split-second decisions that have to be made about which interceptors to fire, which kind of missiles, how to distinguish between the missiles and the drones. The human beings are not fast enough to make those decisions. They are already being made by AI, and to great success, as we've seen with Israel. In Ukraine, where you're seeing it most prominently, is this innovation and the response having to do with aerial drones and then electronic warfare. So what's happened is Ukraine, as you've seen, has employed drones to great effect on the defense. Right? They've made the battlefield transparent. Drones have also, if you look at it, made the kind of war of maneuver very difficult to conduct now. War by surprise. Right? So Patton is not beating drones. Right? Drones are beating Patton. The Russians have responded with electronic warfare, jamming. You've seen incredible amounts of jamming all along the front, 1,000-kilometer front. So what's happened is that Ukraine, and I think the Russians will too, are using AI to allow autonomous drones with the ability to strike targets, because there's no other way to operate drones now against sophisticated electronic war defenses. And just to give you a sense of the scale, in 2024 alone, so far, 3 million drones have been used in the Ukraine war. So think about once you start deploying those number of drones and they're networked with AI, because you have to let them operate autonomously to have effect, you're going to see the effects, which is, I think actually, in both these cases with Israel and missile defense and Ukraine with drones, they seem to advantage the defender. Right? I think that it's much harder to conduct offensive operations when you're up against robotics and autonomous weapons. So pull a step back then and say, what kind of regulatory attitude should we have to those kinds of developments? So in our book, Jeremy made a very strong, I think persuasive argument, because I let him put it in there, but I thought very persuasive argument that from a moral perspective, it would be wrong to retard the development of these kinds of weapon systems. They particularly help democratic regimes like Israel, like Ukraine, defend themselves from autocratic aggressors. If you think that in the future, the threat to international stability and to American national security is going to become from autocratic aggressors, then Jeremy thinks morally it would be wrong to handcuff yourself as a democracy to prevent your nations from being able to develop and deploy defenses which equalize the battlefield, which make it easier to defend yourself from aggressors. A second point, and then turn over, I think also from a functional perspective or an instrumental perspective, this sort of ban killer robots perspective, the idea that we should intervene now to regulate artificial intelligence doesn't make sense. And here I bring you back to first year law school. Sorry for the PTSD I'm about to trigger. But remember in the common law courses, you have a debate between rules and standards. Right? Rules are clear rules, like don't drive 55. Standards are drive reasonably under the circumstances and the weather. Right? We have had some success in the past with rules-based systems for trying to regulate weapons, like no biological weapons, no chemical weapons, no nuclear weapons of certain kinds and sizes. But we've had a lot of failed efforts to regulate military technology through these standards too. Think about World War I, which was the effort to regulate the Industrial Revolution applied to warfare. Banning of submarines, right? Banning of aerial warfare, completely failed. And actually put at a disadvantage the democracies that thought that these kinds of bans could be effective. Second point, do you trust our governments to actually effectively regulate? And this was a point that was first made, when we're up against adversaries that are not going to regulate. These areas where we've had successful regulation of past military technologies have always been in places where if you had regulation, neither side comes out ahead. Right? They really just preserve the status quo. That's why you see nuclear regulation years after nuclear weapons first appear. You see biological and chemical weapons regulation only after both sides realize that they inflict terrible cost for very little gain. And that's actually what happens when you use a standards-based approach. You gain more information, you learn more, you figure out the better regulatory rules, and then you create them, but it takes time and the generation of more information. But do you think that China or other adversaries like Russia are going to agree to a ban and obey any ban if we're in a situation, as I say, where AI technology is developing so fast? So I would say in our book we propose a different approach, which was the better way to achieve some kind of regulation of AI and other cutting-edge military technologies is through deterrence. And the model here is nuclear weapons. The first nuclear weapons treaties don't start appearing until the 60s, right? 20 years after nuclear weapons are first used. And it's only after both sides have built up sufficient deterrence that they don't feel they're going to get any kind of advantage by continuing to compete with each other by building up bigger and bigger stockpiles. Or putting it differently, both sides equally benefit from some kind of mutual restraint. But you can't get to deterrence if you handcuff yourself with regulation and take on limitations on development of AI and weapons that you only impose on yourself while your opponents race ahead. That would actually be the most counterproductive approach to trying to handle AI when you take it in the context of competition with our great power rivals in the world. So thank you very much. Look forward to your comments.
Well, we've truly covered the field here. We went from the Dalai Lama to nuclear war. So we'll see what we've got to draw out some of these points. I'd like to talk a little bit about, since we're at a time of political transition here in the United States, Mr. Baker, you mentioned the AI Safety Institute. That is a creation via executive fiat of the current administration. The current has no statutory basis whatsoever. The current administration also has issued a series of executive orders of increasing length. I mean, these are things, I have reviewed them. They take whole binders, not making this up. If you print them out, they are list after list of priorities and goals and instructing basically every agency in the cabinet to have some role with regard to the regulation or use of artificial intelligence, and maybe this AI Safety Institute, again with no statutory basis whatsoever, was supposed to serve as a coordinator among the cabinet agencies to do this. They've got teams of people right now looking at executive orders and thinking about how things should look on January the 21st, 2021, after all the 2025, after all the celebrations are done. I'm curious, we've got members of the regulated community, we've got former regulators on the panel. I'd like to go down and talk to each of you, and just if you have ideas, knowing what the current administration has created, and thinking about what the future administration may want to do, what would you advise them to do with the framework that they are inheriting in January? I'll first start with you, Ms. Jeffries.
Well, I would say that first, as to the US AI Safety Institute, it presents sort of an interesting dilemma, because we are seeing these sorts of centers pop up in jurisdictions around the world. And so what is a US company to do? We would much prefer to be, if regulated at all, by the US government and not be beholden to some other government. And so I think that that raises a tricky public policy question of, well, if the US doesn't think that we need to be getting into this, what is the US government going to do bilaterally or in a multilateral setting to address the requirements that are being put on US companies in other jurisdictions?
So the safety institutes are what we sold to our allies as the way light touch regulation could be implemented, and that they could have a role if they had their own safety institutes interacting with ours. So there is some value in having a safety institute on our end so that we can coordinate and more or less control what the UK or Japan does on those topics. So I'm not sure I would get rid of them. There are some very serious national security issues associated with AI. It's, potentially crucial to our competition with China in the national security sphere. We will want to have, there's a national security memorandum that the president released that's mostly okay. But the rest of the structure that's been put in place by people who actually, I think, bragged to me that they think they set a record for a length of an executive order. It needs to be really carefully worked through, precisely because buried deep in them are things like the risk management framework that I talked about earlier. So it's going to be a big job just to clean out the Augean stables there, but there is a pony in there somewhere.
My limited comment on this is that there's this perception that there are these large corporations doing AI. But as we know, most disruption doesn't really occur in large corporations. There's this innovator's dilemma, and maybe some of the development is to extend their existing position and reinforce that position. But more importantly, as Victoria mentioned, having Jan LeCun now at Meta, when we look at deep reinforcement learning, it was Jan LeCun, Jeff Hinton, people like that as academics doing this work. So are you really going to be in a position to tell academics what they can and can't research, and what they can and can't as a matter of their expression of their creativity and their humanity, limit their ability to publish and move forward human knowledge? Because if you view this as existential, they're on to the next thing after large language models. And even large language models were viewed as not probably going to result in something great, and it turned out to be wrong. But the next generation may not be just a larger training data set and much more editing. And I think there is a real question about freedom of expression and freedom to investigate that has to be inquired upon.
No, I'll pick up on Christopher's last point. One thing that's different about military technology from the perspective I was describing is that from maybe the 1930s to through the nuclear age, we were accustomed to advances in technology in the military area as being driven by government research and development, and then there would be positive spillovers to the civilian economy. So, we had the Apollo program, and then we got Tang, right? Most of you are too young to remember Tang, I guess, but you're really missing out. It was great stuff. But that was the model, and I think it's the reverse now. Military R&D is making slow progress, and all these advances, if you look at Ukraine, is people in the field taking civilian technologies widely available commercially, commercial drones, and adapting them to military effect. And that the advantage that you were also turned out from the beginning was, democracies with decentralized governments and innovation cultures, which even like a place like Ukraine is, not to mention the United States, are the ones that are making the fastest advances in this area. So the idea of the White House issuing an executive order that I think it was like 85 pages when I printed it out, that's going to tell us how to take advantage of AI, again, is the exact worst approach. And I encourage you all to at least read the first 3 pages before you fall asleep. I mean, there's a provision on DEI, right? AI is not to be developed by the United States government without taking into account diversity, equity, and the I is not innovation. There's a provision on American workers, right? Of course, this is going to be a process of technology is going to make American workers more productive, and then the workers who are out of business from AI are going to hopefully find something else to do.
Jobs as well
Yeah,
is in there too.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. It says AI shall not be developed by the United States government in a way that harms American workers, right? Whatever that means. So the idea that that we want to, instead of looking and seeing what we've seen in Ukraine, where lack of government regulation, quick adoption of commercially available technologies that are just developed outside the realm of government, and instead you're going to replace it with White House regulation, I think is actually utterly foolish. And then, I disagree a little bit with Stewart. I mean, I get that we had to offer these institutes to the Europeans, basically, so that, they would cooperate with us. I really worry about us being infected in any way with European approaches to regulation, particularly in innovation. I mean, this is a governing system over there which has crushed innovation. They do not have a decentralized innovation culture. It's Ukraine that's developing AI drones, not France. Right? Do we want to encourage expanded government role in AI development when what we've seen with government before is regulating with lack of information, unintended consequences, and capture by big business? Right? That's been the story of regulation in the United States before the 1970s and the deregulation movement. Would we expect anything different to occur if we allow government a much freer hand to regulate AI technology? But it's deadly serious because we're not talking now about the prices for airline tickets. We're talking about the development of technologies that will be useful for us to defend ourselves against China and Russia, Iran, North Korea, and their buddies.
I'd like to flip the coin for a moment with this next question, and I'll direct it first to Professor Yu and Mr. Baker, and then our representatives from the private sector can chime in if they have thoughts. But the ambit on my court is international trade. And there's been quite a lot of discussion in the Congress and in the executive branch about trying to preserve or keep or at least slow down the technological advancement of China and preserve our own technological superiority. And there have been efforts to create a CFIUS panel for outbound investment that have been put forward by Senator John Cornyn, for instance. There have been efforts to try to convince the Netherlands and Taiwan to join us in not selling certain highly technically capable semiconductor chips to countries with which we are hostile, China, and other such efforts to try to retard and slow down their development and control who our own companies can share internationally their technological innovations with. Playing off of the discussion that we just had, I'm curious what Professor Yu and Mr. Baker and then the private sector entities that would be subject to any such regulations or laws think about these efforts, both in terms of whether they will happen and whether they could be successful at all. Professor Yu, I'll start with you.
So first, I'm not so worried about China surpassing us in terms of AI innovation. You're talking about a different thing, which is China stealing intellectual property essentially from the United States. And the reason I say this about China is, this is a government that actually believes in rules. They don't believe in decentralized innovation. They don't believe in the light touch of government regulation. Think about some of their government policies. The one-child policy. Right. By the way, ask someone from China. I had a Chinese LLM student. I was saying, this one-child policy, where did it come from? Who thought this was a great idea? Believe it or not, unless the student was lying to me, and she could have been, she's long gone, I can't fail her now. But she said that the father of the Chinese nuclear missile program was the inventor of the one-child policy, and he was just such a national hero that after he was done designing nuclear weapons, he went the other direction and decided to end human life another way. And he said, let's not have any children. And the Politburo thought this guy was a genius, and they issued this, atrocious regulation. But that's a Chinese style of government. I'm not worried about them surpassing us with AI in the end. But I do see the point about them stealing our AI technology, right? And so we were actually having this interesting discussion before the panel. Generally, the empirical research shows that trade sanctions generally don't work when it comes to trying to actually stop countries or change their foreign policies or national security policies. We may impose these sanctions. They may impose a cost on China, but whether they actually get China to change in any way is unlikely. If you look at maybe our relations with the Soviet Union, the Soviets stole a lot of our technology. They stole basically our microprocessor technology. What they didn't have was the ability to manufacture it. And so maybe that's the way to think of it. It's very hard to contain the spread of ideas, to try to shut down scientific discussion and research, but maybe what we want to do is prevent China from accumulating the capital and manufacturing ability to turn the ideas into actual technology.
Mr. Baker?
So I half agree with John. It's true that in the end, innovation and decentralization in a free market comes out better than an autocracy, if the autocracy lets you stick around to the end. And the worry I have, and this is demonstrated by years of history, is that if a autocracy decides it absolutely wants to own a particular industry, it can do it. It will come at a great cost to a whole bunch of other industries that the autocracy is not caring about, but they can drive their internal market, and God knows China has a very buoyant private sector. It's not dominant, but it is very buoyant, and they will do a lot of innovation, and the government can say, and all that innovation is going to stay here. Nobody's going to buy stuff from the American companies. We're going to freeze them out of our market, and then we're going to go out and undersell them in foreign markets. That is a great strategy for, they've done it in steel and a whole bunch of other industries. So a controlled market can have targeted successes, and there's just no doubt that every government on the planet thinks that AI is the key to their future economy, and they're going to be driving with all of their incentives and their power toward it. So there is a real risk that even without stealing it, which of course they will do, the Chinese could surpass us in AI. So that's an argument for saying, well, let's do what we can to get in their way. And I think that does make sense. But the fact is that all of the sanctions and the tariffs and the difficulties that we're going to create are modest obstructions. They are not going to solve our problem. Just as sanctions today have not stopped the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There are workarounds. We can't really control what happens in third countries where once the price gets about 25% above what you can get it on the market for, you can probably get it in any sanctioned country. So that's all we're doing. We're putting a 25% tax on these technologies going to China.
Ms. Jeffries?
I agree entirely with Professor Yu's points, and just to elaborate a little bit on this idea of theft and reverse engineering. In the AI context, those sorts of restrictions would effectively shut down open source AI or any kind of openness potentially. And so if you believe in even a little bit in any of the national security and economic benefits of more readily or freely available open source models, it certainly harms that. But I think the other side of the coin is that closed models as a defense is a red herring because of the theft and the reverse engineering. It's sort of an illusory security, I think. And so going back to the point that the best way is to outcompete and outpace. I wonder, to inject into the conversation, what folks might think of restrictions on things given how attractive the US market is, and what effect that may have. I haven't heard a lot of discussion about that in public, but.
In terms of what the government can do, I would say that, as I tried to articulate earlier, one of the issues that leads to supremacy of an AI model is the availability of training data. So an autocratic government can clearly, if it prioritizes above all things having accessible data, it can just suck up all that data, forget about the rules regarding any of the safeguards around the data, and make it available to its models. what has happened in the US and certainly in Europe, even more so in Europe, is a form of control over personal data because of the concerns that are legitimate in many cases about privacy, but it doesn't really help you if you're really trying to optimize something that needs human training data. So I think there is a discussion that has to be had about how to create data commons and maybe the role of either voluntary industry associations such as the Linux Foundation and allowing large companies to operate together and have ethically sourced data within the constraints of existing law, or maybe the government even participating and moderating in that and accelerating that so that we can have a competitive data set to the Chinese data set, and we at least can compete on a fair, balanced battlefield.
Professor, you or Mr. Baker, do either of you have a point to offer in regard to Ms. Jeffries' question about worrying about things coming into the country as opposed to out of the country?
So we could, I suppose, refuse to buy stuff that came from China as a way of trying not to support their industry. There may come a time when we want to do that. We probably are at that point with like solar panels and a few other things where they stole the technology and then kicked U.S. companies out of their market and then the world market. I don't think we're there yet.
The other input in AI is human beings and intelligence, and I think it would be, I think actually even President Trump, despite the election results, said he would like actually to give permanent resident status to people who get PhDs in computer science or MAs in AI coming even from places like China. I would like bring them here from China and not let them leave. I would like, let's have it all come in, right? So
I think they should just do a TikTok video explaining why they hate Xi Jinping.
or the AI can do one. We'll take their student ID photo and put them in top of one of those videos. Then we don't have a problem anymore. No, but I mean, one input is how do we keep the human capital in the United States to generate the innovation? Because, so here's a pitch for just a short story about lawyers and what role we play in all this is, I remember in the late 80s, I was deciding to go off to law school, and I was taking a class from the great sociologist Daniel Bell. He's the guy who came up with the idea of the information economy, and he's the one who wrote a book called The Post-Industrial Society. He predicted a lot of this, and he wrote the book in 1965. It's incredible. And so I went to him, and I said, this is the late 80s, and I said, oh, Professor Bell, I'm part of the problem, not the solution. He said, what do you mean? He said, well, Japan has no lawyers. This is when we thought Japan was going to take over the world, not China. Oh, they don't have any lawyers. They don't have any litigation. All the smart people become engineers, and they make products. And he said to me, he said, the most dominant economies, innovation and success will correlate with more lawyers. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about, Professor? I'm glad you're retiring this year because otherwise there'd be some Alzheimer tests. Because it was his last year. He was retiring after that class. And he said, this because information is free, and it's impossible to stop its movement. And so there will be no investment in innovation for an information economy unless you have a legal system and lawyers who protect it like property. So he said, yes, you can have all the engineers you want in China and Japan, but without a legal system where you invest human capital into the development of ideas and you protect them and people can get value out of them, it's not going to happen in those countries. So yes, you could have a massive government like Manhattan Project in AI in China. I'd rather trust an American legal system where we treat these things as property, you make money off it. All of us here protect those property rights. And Professor Bell said that will be the way the United States maintains its dominance. And that was 30-some years ago, and I'm damned if he's not right, and I think that's a good model for us to pursue in the future.
I've got one more question, and then I hope we will turn to the audience, and you'll have some good questions to close us out. And it plays off of the human element that Professor Yu was just mentioning. And we've had a lot of talk, it occurs to me today, about values. We've talked about whose values will control the development of AI, perhaps from a nationalistic standpoint, the United States versus some other country. We've talked about whether diversity, equity, inclusion, other ideas should govern AI. And in past debates with technology, we've even had instances in Silicon Valley of certain famous companies' employees, stating that for various reasons they don't want to work on technological projects that might aid, for example, the U.S. Defense Department, which raised national security concerns not that long ago. And so I'm curious what the panelists think about the human concept of values and who it is that will ultimately decide what values govern our artificial intelligence. Will it be the market ultimately, or will it be something else? Ms. Jeffries?
Well, I suppose this is probably the right time for me to confess that I'm an antitrust lawyer by training. And so I believe deeply in competition, and probably most so when it comes to ideas. And so I think there's probably no better crucible than the market. And that's part of what I was referring to in my opening remarks about the power of exporting US AI. In that day-to-day competition on the ground in Brazil, is the government or is a Brazilian company going to choose a US AI model or a Chinese AI model, or maybe some third? We'd like it to be US, I think all of us in this room. And maybe there isn't any single integration that changes things, but in the aggregate, it matters a lot. So that's my sort of circuitous answer.
Mr. Ekren?
I think you're going to have competition whether you say you don't want competition or not. And I think the competition is of people that are more brilliant than I am, that want to understand reality. And you could be like Bishop Berkeley, who I guess in some way is similar to the Dalai Lama in the sense that most reality is really subjective and, you know, it's a figment of the mind. But the problem is the people who are creating the future technologies, you know, generally in this and even in physics, are people that are coming from a theoretical world into a real world that affects us as humans. And restricting that in any way, I think, is just allowing someone else to be unrestricted. So at the end of the day, we need to have free academia, and corporations should compete, but we need to have openness so that there is a ability for people to understand what is going on, and then if in our limited understanding of what's happening, it's going in the wrong direction, we can step in and hopefully, with the benefit, move from that standards-based world that Professor Yu has talked about, where you have sort of a soft touch and then quickly make an adjustment if we learn that we need to be a little bit more emphatic about things.
So I think right now, the Silicon Valley Karen culture is winning, and we're going to have a fight to take those values out of the AI that we end up using. The market will, in the end, override that because, you know, nobody wants to buy a machine that's smart enough to say, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that," which is what we're getting from Karen safetyism. So in the end, the market will win, but it will be nice to have the fight first rather than have it later.
All right. Hopefully we got some questions. I see some hands going up. Do we ever get any microphones for this room? We do. All right. So let the microphone come to you and then ask your question.
So my question is for Ms. Jeffries and Professor Yu, given your unique expertise here. So you're talking about
The AI said it was offensive and controversial.
No, I think the point, I'm really going to some of the comments you've made and the open source issue. So it's interesting to speak about state actors in a military context, but I think the real concern, and this relates to a regulatory framework, would be potentially of non-state actors, because it's very cheap. So if you release everything publicly, anybody basically can use them. And costs nothing. It's not like a nuclear weapon where it's extremely hard to develop a nuclear weapon. It's extremely expensive. Anybody can basically do it, as you suggest in Ukraine. So how do you design a regulatory framework to prevent against proliferation? That's probably the biggest danger of AI to everyone. It's probably non-state actors that can do whatever they want with it if they're properly trained.
So just a comment, you're right about nuclear weapons, but I think AI in the sense of cheap, easy accessibility is true of biological and chemical weapons. So biological weapons, as we unfortunately learned in the COVID experience, is a small laboratory can make a deadly pathogen. It can, release from a laboratory. Maybe they designed the pathogen intentionally or not, but you can see from the COVID experience how easy it would be now with not too sophisticated biological research equipment to produce a virus that could harm, everybody in the world. So I'm just saying the access you need to produce deadly technology is not just true of AI, it's also true of biological weapons, somewhat true of chemical weapons too. So how do we successfully regulate those? So I think there were efforts to just sort of completely ban things, but I actually think that we relied a lot on non-governmental regulation. I think we relied on the scientific community to self-regulate itself. Maybe that's, maybe the COVID experience showed that wasn't foolproof. I think, but the basic problem is that AI, like biological, like chemical, maybe not so much nuclear, is a dual-use technology that has so many great civilian applications. Do you, restrict those positive benefits to the economy because you're worried about what Stewart's talking about, this risk, this small percentage risk that it could result in something catastrophic. I think this is something we faced before humanity with mass production, with the Industrial Revolution, with the nuclear age, and we didn't end up banning everything in that way that some people want to.
Because anyone can do it. So if you have the training, if you ban it, they'll just do it anyway. So that's what with the open source issue. Do you have ways that you can? Do you have ways that you can prevent proliferation? I work with a number of AI companies all over the world. They're all using open source. I mean, they're just PhDs in artificial intelligence. They're not just. I mean, anyone can't do it, but that's a relatively inexpensive a resource compared to what weaponry and that sort of thing. I mean.
Yeah, I think I would add to Professor Yu's excellent remarks that an open source AI has, or certainly Metas do, certain guardrails built into it that, so it doesn't come trained ready to give you instructions on how to make a nuclear weapon. So a non-expert with AI is not a substitute for an expert with access to material with AI. So it kind of loops back to the original problem, which is what do you do about this weapons proliferation and the knowledge and the like. AI is not going to be the thing that makes a difference, I think, there.
It seems to me that AI is a revolutionary technology, and like any revolutionary technology, you have some people that say it's going to destroy the world, other people that want to use it to try to control or influence the culture. We've seen this 1,000 times before. It's a tool, and although you can take a hammer and use it for bad ends, it seems like we should be regulating those bad ends, not the hammer. That would seem to be the better way to go forward with regulation in the AI world. What do you think about that and focusing on kind of the ends on how people use AI and prohibiting those rather than regulating AI itself?
It seems to me pretty obvious that that's a better approach. Unless you really think that the development of the AI itself and using it to develop the next generation and the next generation and the next generation is going to lead to the technology getting out of your control. One of the interesting things that people have said about this is that when you talk about regulating AI, often what people are really talking about is regulating corporations and regulating capitalism. It's the same fear of a dynamic that just goes on without end. And some people are deeply uncomfortable with that possibility.
So I used AI for the first time in 1976 playing a computer chess program at the University of Washington in Seattle. I went on to work at Microsoft, do a few other things. One of the things people, you think about regulating in America, and you want to regulate activities and behavior in America. You got almost 200 countries around the world. And so it doesn't matter what we do here, if there is this chance of artificial general intelligence that's going to wipe out humanity, there's a whole bunch of other places that could happen. So the hubris for us Americans to think we can have some regulation that would prevent that scenario seems quite silly to me. So why wouldn't we just not get out of the business of AI regulation altogether? We didn't regulate the internet really. Internet Explorer is my fault. I built the first 3 versions of IE 30 years ago. We didn't have regulation. No one was telling us, oh my God, you might create TikTok or Facebook or something.
So I'm not sure. Yeah, it's not quite that crazy. I'm not an apologist for doomer regulation, but you don't need to say, don't make doomer products. But you could say, hey, look, there are things that we know could lead to bad outcomes. If the AI starts lying to us, if the AI starts going to the outside world and doing things and then hiding it, if it starts accumulating resources and power that it intends to use and doesn't tell you it's got them, we need to be a little worried. So let's try to find some steps there that would make us worry and watch for those in the products that we're developing in the next generation. Doesn't strike me as crazy regulation.
Stewart just described to me that the AI is becoming more human-like.
Yes, are you?
In fact, he might become Attorney General again.
Are you getting comfort from that?
I thought he was describing the federal government myself.
But I say the other alternative is, right, like, yeah, you could say this negative approach of regulation by prohibition isn't going to work. So what do? Instead, you try to create the positive incentives to create faster innovation on our part. And just while you were talking, for example, it reminded me of Tocqueville talking about the role of lawyers in protecting civil society from the government so that now he's not talking about culture of innovation, he's talking just about the freedom of civil society. But I think that's the other way to think about regulation, is what would be the positive benefits of reducing regulation and lawyers being the forefront of that, so that the aspects of our culture that lead to this innovation are enhanced rather than suppressed through, I think, the heavy hand. That said, I hate Internet Explorer. Damn you, sir, damn you.
Clark Forsyth, a question for Professor Yu and then the rest of the panel. Instead of a heavy-handed approach, what do you think about adopting kind of an analogy from tort law and the doctrine of informed consent, whereas those who innovate and distribute and market the drugs and devices and products have an obligation of kind of heightened informed consent to release the data as to the benefits and potential risks, and to inform the consumer what data they don't have and what risks they don't know?
I think the misfortune of being on a podcast with Richard Epstein has made me far too open to the possibilities of using tort law to solve all of human problems. But I think the point, though, is also there's this sort of, on the one hand, there's regulation versus no regulation. There is like no regulation. The alternative is the Anglo-American common law system of decentralized regulation through standards, acting reasonably, gathering information, and then trying to figure out the rules. And I think the tort system actually is a good alternative system of a decentralized regulatory approach. So I can't decide right now whether this aspect of tort law you've borrowed would make the best sense for AI, but I feel very confident that we should take tort law ideas and concepts and try to apply them, rather than thinking the White House is going to issue an executive order that's 88 pages long that's going to think of all the issues we need to think about to successfully regulate AI.
that because it's worked so well with software licensing of adhesions?
Internet Explorer got 98% market share. You weren't listening.
And then they got sued by the government for antitrust, but that's a different group. Final question.
May I, just a quick
go right
response?
ahead, yeah.
We have an interesting example just from September of this year, not exactly in tort, but coming out of the Federal Trade Commission. And it's maybe a bit of a warning to us all. In an interesting case called Writer, it's an AI company that makes a number of chatbots and the like. And the FTC decided to investigate and ultimately bring a complaint against this company under a means and instrumentalities theory. This is based on a 1922 case. But essentially, they made their tool available to another party who then used it to write fraudulent product reviews. And I commend the dissenting opinions from Commissioners Ferguson and Holyoake, who very eruditely go through sort of the inevitable thing that happens if you follow the logic that the majority did in voting out the complaint, which is meant to be a fairly narrow doctrine that makes sense in its narrow context. But you ultimately get to a place where it's like, okay, are we going to hold liable the pen manufacturers and the paper printers for those who use those instruments to commit crimes or defraud others and so forth? So I think that's sort of the kind of tension to be thinking of in a tort context, for instance, as well.
I think there's also the broader view that, for example, in autonomous vehicles, which is this combination of robotics and AI that everybody's fascinated with right now, that you are going to have individual people that are injured, but the argument is that the ultimate benefit of having a system where every car communicates with everyone and it follows standard rules is in the long term going to save lives. But that doesn't mean in a court system in a particularly stacked state that is, owned by a plaintiff's bar, that you aren't going to have huge disincentives against companies to try to innovate with AI and make those cars that ultimately will save millions of lives available. So who makes that decision? And I think in a society like China, they can manage their tort laws that way, since they have tort laws. In the US, it's going to be interesting to see how we navigate.
Okay, we have one final question from the lady in the center.
Well, this is more as a parent. I know we won't have the Department of Education to work with on this going forward, but I just wonder if anyone is concerned about future generations and the reliance on the technology, because I know in the schools, they're already concerned about how it's being used, that we don't dummy down generation after generation because people can't think anymore. Is that silly?
The ancient Greeks thought that would happen with writing. People will stop memorizing things, and they thought that with the printing press. In higher education, which is far easier than teaching K through 12, I have to say, but not as annoying either. You're already seeing, take Zoom for example. I think you're seeing huge productivity gains in education itself. Like AI is allowing a single teacher to be much more effective at indoctrinating students in Marxism. That's just a joke. I'm really not. That's not what I'm doing. But but you could see, right? Zoom, everything we saw during COVID. Actually, it also showed parents what was going on in the classroom during COVID and allowed for a correction. But I think you're going to see AI actually help education reach broader levels and also raise everybody up, despite all the many problems you described with AI for kids.
Anyone else like to address that?
I keep almost agreeing with John, but the fact is, it's so easy to produce something that looks like you thought about a problem when all you did is ask an AI engine to produce a piece of work.
And you're confusing AIs with human beings.
Well, but we want our kids to actually learn how to think through a problem and how to summarize an argument. And if all they do is say, give me a summary of this argument, they haven't learned anything. And so we're going to, at a minimum, have to reformulate education so that we find another way to teach people to think these problems through, other than just asking them to write about them.
Yeah, I will say on a personal level, this is a question that consumes me because I have a little girl. She is in kindergarten this year. And I think about all the time, what is the world going to look like when she enters the workforce? And what skills does she need to build right now so that she's prepared to encounter that world and provide a positive impact in that world? And so I find myself once again agreeing with Professor Yu on all of the potential wonderful educational benefits that AI may present. And also maybe a positive challenge to all of us to be thinking about for education of youth, for education of young associates, teaching them how to think, which is different than rote memorization of facts. And so even in a world with AI, I mean, this was pre all the wonderful discovery tools that I understand exist now. I actually enjoyed doing some amount of document review because you get to understand what's actually going on in the documents of a company or of an opposing party. You get a feeling for their language, and just getting a report out from your colleagues or from, spit out from the computer isn't going to give you that sort of feeling. And that's just it's an approach to learning and understanding that we're probably going to have to embrace in a more systematic way as we integrate AI more fully into society. But that's just one person's musings.
All right, if you'll join me in thanking our panel.